Okay, so get ready because today we're doing a deep dive into a really, really tragic story.
Yeah.
The story of Hind Rajab.
Absolutely.
She was a 5-year-old Palestinian girl who became kind of a symbol of that awful 2024 Israel-Hamas war.
Right.
We've got a lot of sources here to try to sort through everything. We've got
Yeah.
Wikipedia news reports, all those like crazy in-depth investigation reports that have been coming out, even some social media posts from back when it was actually happening. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hind's case is so fascinating and so disturbing because you have the initial tragedy, but then you have the mystery that comes afterward.
Right.
And so for 12 days, this little girl is alone, trapped, injured in a car, and the whole world is watching.
It's insane.
It's insane.
And it all started on January 29th, right in the middle of the war.
Right.
And Hind and her family were just trying to get out of Gaza City,
Absolutely. They're
trying to escape the violence.
Yeah, just imagine you're in this black Kia, packed with your loved ones, just trying to get out of a war zone.
Right. And then everything goes wrong.
Everything goes south. They're driving through Tel Al-Hawa, which was under heavy fire.
Right.
And their vehicle is shelled. Hind's aunt, uncle, and 4 of her cousins are killed instantly.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
But then it gets even crazier.
Right.
Because Hind's 15-year-old cousin, Layan,
Right.
she calls the Palestinian Red Crescent Society,
The PRCS.
the PRCS,
Yeah.
pleading for help.
Pleading for help.
And in that call, you can actually hear her describing an Israeli tank right next to their car.
Yeah, and that audio has been released.
Brilliant.
It's tough to listen to.
It's awful.
You can hear Layan's voice. She's scared, and then suddenly the call is cut off by the sound of machine gun fire.
It's one of those things you hear it and you just get chills.
It's awful.
So then little Hind is all alone.
Right.
And she gets on the phone,
Terrified.
terrified.
Yeah.
And she's on the phone with the PRCS dispatcher for 3 hours,
3 hours.
saying things like,
Say, I'm scared.
yeah, please come take me. Please, will you come?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
It's really hard to hear.
So the PRCS, they're trying to get her help,
Yeah.
working with everybody they can, the Gaza Health Ministry, even trying to coordinate with the Israeli military
Wow.
to get an ambulance through
Right.
safely.
But it's a war zone.
It's the middle of a war zone.
Right.
Yeah.
So finally, an ambulance crew gets the go-ahead.
Right.
They set off
Right.
on this rescue mission.
Right.
And then radio silence.
Radio silence.
They report being targeted by laser lights, and then the connection is lost.
Wow.
The ambulance and everybody inside vanish.
Vanished.
For 12 days, nobody knew what happened to Hind or the paramedics.
I remember when this was happening.
Oh, yeah.
And social media was just exploding with theories.
Of course.
Some people were saying Hamas was using laser targeting. Others were saying it was Israeli forces.
Right.
It was impossible to tell what was true.
It was a mess.
It really was. And it wasn't until February 10th, after the Israeli military had pulled back from the area, that Hind's family could even go back to the site.
Oh, gosh.
And what they find is just devastating. The car is a wreck, riddled with bullet holes. And just a few feet away is the ambulance.
Oh, my God.
Also destroyed, completely destroyed. Everyone is dead.
Everyone.
On her cousins and the 2 paramedics.
Wow.
Just a horrific scene.
And what did the Israeli military say?
Their initial response was, nothing to do with us.
Really?
No troops in the area, so we didn't need to coordinate any rescue.
No troops.
No troops.
But that's where things started to fall apart.
Right, because that's not what happened.
Yeah.
Independent investigations, like the one by Al Jazeera, they found evidence of 3 Israeli tanks.
Right near the car.
Right near where the family's car was attacked.
Wow.
And then the Washington Post took it even further. They used satellite imagery to confirm that there were Israeli armored vehicles present.
Right.
They even found a 300-millimeter hole in the ambulance.
And that's important because...
That's key. That kind of damage is consistent with an Israeli tank round.
So that really starts to poke holes in the Israeli military story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It casts doubt on those denials.
Yeah. And to make things even more confusing, the Palestinian Red Crescent Society came out and said that the Israeli military never even contacted them about the incident.
Right.
Which totally contradicts what the U.S. State Department was saying.
Right. They were saying that the Israelis were cooperating.
Right.
So it was a mess of conflicting accounts.
Total mess.
So you have accusations, denials flying back and forth.
Right.
He said, she said.
Right.
But then a truly independent group enters the picture.
Okay.
Forensic architecture.
I've heard of them.
They're known for doing these incredibly detailed investigations.
Right.
Using visual evidence, audio analysis, you name it.
Right.
They spent months piecing together what happened to Hind in the ambulance.
And what did they find?
Their findings were shocking.
Right, because we kind of knew it was bad.
We knew it was bad, but they took it to another level.
Yeah.
What forensic architecture uncovered was truly disturbing. Their analysis revealed that an Israeli tank had likely fired 335 rounds at the car.
335 rounds.
335 rounds at the car, carrying Hind and her family.
Oh, my gosh.
And even more chilling, they concluded that the same tank likely attacked the ambulance as well.
Wow.
But here's the kicker. They also determined that the tank operators would have been able to see civilians inside the car.
So not an accident.
Not a mistake. Not a case of mistaken identity. This was starting to look like something far more deliberate.
Right.
And that's where the real outrage began.
Yeah, because for those 12 days that Hind was missing, the whole world was watching this story.
Right.
Hoping for a miracle.
Hoping for a miracle.
And then the news of her death and like all the circumstances surrounding it
Right.
came out, and it was just insane.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just like the brutality of it all, you know?
Right.
It felt like part of a bigger pattern.
Yeah, Hind's story really became a catalyst for taking a deeper look at how this war was impacting Palestinian children. Like organizations like the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor, they started digging into other incidents.
Yeah.
And what they found was really unsettling. They actually suggested that Hind and her family were killed in what they called a planned execution
Wow.
by the Israeli army.
And it wasn't just accusations.
No. They found shell fragments at the site where the ambulance was destroyed that matched a specific type of U.S.-made missile.
Wait a second. U.S.-made missile.
Hold on.
So now the U.S. is involved.
Right now you have another player in this whole thing.
Exactly. The U.S. gives so much military aid to Israel.
Yeah.
So this brings up some really uncomfortable questions about, like, American involvement.
Absolutely.
Even complicity in the deaths of Palestinian civilians.
Right.
Including Hind.
Yeah. So, okay, what about the investigation into Hind's death specifically?
Right.
Did anyone actually face any consequences for what happened?
Well, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, claimed they did an internal investigation.
Okay.
And they said, again, that their troops weren't even in the area when the car was attacked. So they couldn't be held responsible.
But we know that that's not true.
Right.
We have multiple independent investigations.
Right.
Al Jazeera, the Washington Post forensic architecture,
Right.
all placing Israeli tanks at the scene.
It's like they weren't even trying.
Yeah, it's almost like they weren't even trying to make their story believable.
Right.
And it points to this bigger issue of lack of transparency.
Right.
The IDF has this history of doing these closed-door investigations,
Right.
and critics say that they're just not credible. It
Yes.
looks like they're investigating themselves,
Right.
and surprise, surprise, finding themselves innocent.
Classic.
Yeah, believe us, we investigated ourselves, and we did nothing wrong.
Right.
Not exactly confidence-inspiring.
Not at all.
Yeah.
So even with all this evidence
Yeah.
and all the pressure from the international community,
Right.
there was no real accountability from Israel.
Well, hold on. The case did eventually get passed on to the General Staff Fact-Finding Assessment Mechanism. It's supposed to be an independent military body within the IDF.
Independent.
Yeah, I know it sounds a little bit like the fox guarding the hen house.
Right.
A lot of human rights groups have criticized this mechanism, saying it doesn't really have the power to do truly impartial investigations.
So more of the same.
Pretty much.
Meanwhile, the U.S. government said they were devastated by the incident,
Right.
and they called for a timely investigation.
Okay.
It felt like the international community was finally starting to pay attention.
Yeah. But calling for an investigation is easy.
Right.
The question is what happens next.
Right. What actions are taken?
What concrete action, if any, is taken based on those findings?
Right.
That's where things get tricky.
And remember the Red Crescent?
Right.
The ones who were actually trying to rescue Hind?
Right.
They said the Israeli military never even contacted them,
Right.
even though the U.S. State Department said they were cooperating.
Exactly. So it was like this carefully choreographed dance. Everyone saying the right things, but nobody actually taking responsibility.
So political.
It's a perfect illustration of how political this whole conflict is.
Absolutely.
Trying to get justice in this kind of environment, it's like navigating a minefield.
And then in July 2024, independent experts appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, they said that Hind's killing might be a war crime.
Whoa. Okay, so now we're not just talking about a tragic accident.
Right. This is a potential violation of international law.
Exactly.
And then in October 2024, Sky News did their own investigation.
Right.
And they found that the damage to the ambulance was consistent with it being hit by a large caliber weapon.
Right. So more evidence pointing towards an Israeli tank?
Right. And they also found this deleted press release from the IDF website.
Oh, really?
that contradicted their claims about not being in the area.
So even months after Hind's death,
Right.
new evidence was still emerging that challenged the official narrative.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
It really is. And with every new revelation, the calls for accountability are getting louder and louder.
Right, because it's becoming impossible to ignore all this evidence.
Right.
That points to a very disturbing conclusion.
Yeah, this wasn't just a fog of war situation.
Right.
This was starting to look like a deliberate act.
Right.
With a deliberate attempt to cover it up.
So where does that leave us?
Right.
We have this young girl caught in this awful war.
All right.
And her story blows up in the media and on social media.
Right.
Investigations start uncovering all these really troubling details.
Yeah.
International pressure starts mounting.
Yeah.
And yet, we still don't have clear answers.
Right.
Or any real accountability.
Hind's story goes beyond the immediate circumstances of her death.
Right.
It forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about the nature of war.
Right.
About the power dynamics that are at play.
Yeah.
And the responsibility that the international community has to protect civilians.
Especially children.
Especially children.
And it highlights how important independent investigations are.
Absolutely.
And journalism.
Yeah.
Because without them, who would hold those in power accountable?
Right. Who would make sure that stories like Hind's aren't just forgotten or swept under the rug?
Exactly. And we can't forget the bigger picture here.
Right.
The Israel-Palestine conflict has been going on for decades.
Decades.
Marked by violence and displacement and just this deep-seated resentment.
Yeah.
Countless lives have been lost.
Absolutely.
Leaving scars on both sides.
Hind's story, as heartbreaking as it is just one of many.
Right.
And it compels us to look beyond the headlines.
Right.
To understand the historical roots of this conflict.
Right.
And the human rights violations that are happening on both sides.
Yeah.
And just the urgent need for a just and lasting peace.
So we've gone through the events surrounding Hind's death.
Yeah.
The conflicting accounts, the investigations, the international response.
Right.
We've even talked about the broader context of the Israel-Palestine conflict. But it feels like we've just scratched the surface.
This is just the beginning.
Right.
Hind's story is still unfolding as new evidence emerges and the fight for justice continues.
Right.
Her legacy lives on not just in the hearts of those who loved her, but also in the ongoing struggle for peace and accountability in the region.
And her story raises so many questions that we all need to think about.
Absolutely.
What is the role of the media in shaping public opinion?
Right.
What is our responsibility to stay informed and engaged?
Right. It challenges us to move beyond these simple narratives.
Right.
To engage with nuance and complexity.
Right.
To recognize the humanity of everyone who is affected by this conflict.
Regardless of which side they're on.
Regardless of which side they're on.
You know, Hind's case kind of sparked another debate, too.
Oh, yeah.
One that goes beyond what actually happened.
Absolutely.
It really got people talking about how the Western media covers the whole Israel-Palestine conflict.
Right.
There were some pretty serious accusations of bias.
Yeah, a lot of people felt like the Palestinian suffering was being downplayed.
Right.
Or that the stories were framed in a way that kind of let Israel off the hook too easily.
And then there was that whole controversy about how Hind was portrayed in some of the news reports.
Right.
Remember that CNN segment where they kept calling her a woman?
I do. Yeah, she was 5.
She was 5 years old.
It was jarring.
It was so jarring.
It was the call adultification.
Right.
It happens a lot when the media talks about children, especially when they're victims of violence.
Right.
They describe them in ways that kind of deny their youth, you know?
Right.
Almost like it makes it easier to dismiss their suffering.
Like if she's already a woman, then maybe her death isn't as tragic.
Right.
Like she's somehow less innocent.
Exactly. It's subtle, but it's powerful.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it plays into this larger pattern we see.
What do you mean?
Well, Palestinian children are often portrayed in Western media as aggressors or threats.
Right.
Instead of the vulnerable kids that they are.
So you're saying that the language used to describe Hind's death, like something as small as calling her a woman,
Right.
is actually part of this much bigger problem in how this conflict is presented to the world.
Exactly.
It's about power and whose story gets told and how.
That's it. Hind's story becomes this powerful example of how media bias and representation, even in small ways, can have huge consequences.
It really makes you wonder how many other stories are being told in ways that distort the truth
Right.
or reinforce harmful stereotypes.
Hind's story, tragic as it is, has had this ripple effect that goes way beyond her death.
Absolutely.
She became a symbol for a lot of people,
Right.
representing the human cost of this conflict
Yeah.
and the desperate need for peace and justice.
So her legacy is this powerful mix of things.
It is.
There's the legal fight to hold those responsible for her death accountable, which is still going on.
Right.
There's this whole movement pushing for the media to accurately represent Palestinian experiences. And of course, the larger struggle to find a solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict itself.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even when faced with such horrific loss, there's still hope.
I like that.
Hind's story can be a catalyst for positive change.
Right.
A way to raise awareness,
Yeah.
challenge the status quo,
Yeah.
and inspire people to act.
So we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
The details of Hind's death, the investigations, the conflicting accounts, the media coverage, the international response, and this whole broader context of the conflict.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It's heavy stuff. So what are we supposed to do with all this?
It can feel overwhelming, right?
does.
The news cycle just throws so much at us these days.
It really does.
But this is why we do these deep dives.
Right.
Knowledge is power, and understanding is the first step towards action.
So what can our listener do?
Well, first, stay informed.
Okay.
Keep learning about the Israel-Palestine conflict, its history, what's happening on the ground right now. There are incredible resources out there. We'll link to some in the show notes.
Awesome.
Don't let this be a one-time thing.
Right.
This conflict isn't going away anytime soon, and neither should our attention to it.
I agree.
Second, don't just sit there.
Right.
If this story moved you, if it angered you, if it broke your heart, do something with those feelings.
Right.
Share it, talk to people, support organizations that are doing good work in the region.
Yeah.
Every voice makes a difference.
Okay, and finally.
Finally, challenge yourself.
Okay.
This conflict is often presented in very black and white terms,
Right.
with a clear good guy and bad guy.
Right.
Push back against that. Seek out diverse voices, question your own assumptions, and work towards a more nuanced understanding of the situation.
I think that's great advice.
The story of Hind Rajab is a tragedy, full stop, but it's also a call to action. We can use what we've learned today to advocate for peace, for justice, for a world where no child has to go through what she went through.
Well said. This has been a tough one, but it's so important to talk about these things. I agree. To really grapple with them.
Absolutely.
Thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.